Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Simeon Yates. I'm Professor of Digital Culture at the University of Liverpool. I'm part of the DDRC Research Centre and team. I'm really glad today to have my colleague Norah present her work. Norah Dunbar is a Professor of Communication Studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and works specifically on how we detect deception. You know, how do we understand if and when and how we are being deceived? I've already seen a version of this talk and it's really insightful. And I think some people might be like, oh gosh, that's surprising. But I'll leave Norah to surprise. And so I'm very thankful for Norah for doing the same talk twice on 2 days to do different audiences as she's traveling around Portugal and the UK. But I think you'll find this really fascinating, and it relates not just to the interpersonal, but also to things like online behaviours and so on, and security issues. So I think it will be of interest to the DDRC community. So Norah, thank you very much. And if I leave it to you, I hopefully the slide share will work and we'll get going.
Okay, let me share my slides now. Okay, so you can see my slides. Great. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Simeon. I'm happy to be here. It's actually maybe a good thing that I ended up giving this on Zoom instead of in person, because I seem to have picked up a bit of a cold in my travels. And so I'm glad that I'm not there sneezing and coughing on everybody. But I'm excited to talk to you about what I have learned in my nearly 30 years studying deception. And here you see a picture of Pinocchio, and this is from the actual Pinocchio store in Italy. And my colleague Joe Walther gave me one of these little guys. I have him hanging in my office because he said every deception researcher should have their own Pinocchio. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the role that Pinocchio plays in the study of deception detection. So I will see my slides advance. There we go. A little overview of what I'm going to cover. First, I'm going to give you a little background on deception, because I know not all of you are deception experts. And so I'm going to kind of catch you up on where we've been and where we're going in the field of deception detection. I'm going to talk about the nonverbal cues that have been studied up until now. There's been a lot of research done in the last several decades. And so I'm going to kind of give you a summary of that. We're going to talk a little bit about whether or not we should continue to study nonverbal cues to deception, given that some scholars like Aldert Vrij, who's at the University of Portsmouth, has said we should not. He says nonverbal cues are too faint and unreliable and we should abandon them. And I don't necessarily agree with that, although I don't think he's entirely wrong. We're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to talk at the end about how AI and machine learning and other automated tools can inform us about deception detection and where we can go from here. Where do we go in the future? Okay, so first of all, what do I mean by nonverbal cues to deception? I mean everything but the words. The words themselves are what I call verbal or linguistic cues to deception, and I'm talking about everything but that. And it's typically divided into a variety of what we call codes of nonverbal communication. Eye movements and blinks, the eye gaze. You may have heard, things like the eyes are the window to the soul. And a lot of people, when I say I study deception, they say, oh, is it true that liars look up to the left and truth tellers look up to the right? And I have to tell them, no, that is not true. Sorry. There's a lot of myths about deception, and a lot of them around the eyes. We can talk about facial expressions. Historically, facial expressions have been divided into sort of 6 primary types: happy, sad, anger, disgust, like that. But there's more nuance now that we have more sophisticated tools. I'm going to talk briefly about micro expressions, because that's also a favorite thing that people love to talk about. Those are like very brief, less than 15 milliseconds on your face before you show your real facial expression. We're going to talk about gestures, illustrator gestures especially, which are the gestures that go along with speech. And adapter gestures, which are the nervous gestures like twiddling with your hair or clicking a pen while you're talking, things like that. Body movements include which direction you lean, trunk movements back and forth, your posture, Vocalic cues are everything about the voice that's not the words. So your pitch, your hesitation, your pauses, even things like how many words you use and what you know length of your sentences are and things like that. Just a brief history. I'm going to fill you in on where we've been in the study of deception of the last long time. Ancient Greeks studied what they called physiognomy, which was the study of determining personality from facial expressions. They thought that things like the height of your forehead could determine whether or not you were a good person or an evil person or things like that. They thought that, the width of your face or the width of your nose or these kinds of things. But it was dismissed as pseudoscience a long time ago. Leonardo da Vinci said that was nonsense. And yet it seems to be making a revival with the advent of AI and automated facial expression analysis. People are saying things like, hockey players with wider faces get more penalties. Or they're saying that they can divine your political affiliation just from the shape of your face. So somehow this is coming back, and it's surprising to see that people are willing to put so much emphasis on just, one or two nonverbal cues, despite the fact that decades of research suggests that's not a very good idea. In 1862, Duchenne de Boulogne compared genuine smiles to fake smiles, and what he said was it was around the eyes that you could tell the difference. A real smile and a fake smile in the mouth don't look very different, but he said that around the eyes you get the crinkling, what we call the crow's feet, on the sides of your eyes, and that will tell you whether or not you are giving a genuine smile or a fake smile. And in fact, nowadays we call them Duchenne and non-Duchenne smiles in honor of him. We can see these photographs from Darwin's book, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. In that book, he had a very brief discussion of deception. But what happened was, even though that wasn't really Darwin's emphasis, it spurred other scientists to start thinking about the face as being the way that we can detect deception. Fast forward a little bit to Paul Ekman, who's one of the most influential scholars in the study of deception detection, and frankly, in my mind, the most important scholar in the study of facial expressions. He wrote this book in 1985 called Telling Lies. He and his colleague Friesen offered what they called the leakage hypothesis in 1969. And what the leakage hypothesis says is that when you're lying, you're trying to look credible, you're trying to look believable, but unwittingly you leak out signs of deception. Mostly, according to Ekman, was in the face, but the leakage cues became a very important thing that we all started looking for. After his book came out in 1985, you'll see a sudden flurry of research on nonverbal cues to deception. You see all of these articles that really there were very few before 1980. If you do a Google search, you won't find very many. After this book came out, wow, you'll find a lot. One of Ekman's most important contributions was the identification of 6 primary facial expressions of emotion. And these include disgust, happiness or joy, sadness, anger, fear, and surprise. And he identified these as universal because he studied indigenous tribes that had not had very much contact with Western society. And he went there and he asked these various tribes to, tell stories about, something sad that had happened or something happy that had happened. And they used the same facial expressions that you can see around the world. So he declared that these primary facial expressions were universal. Since then, I just heard a talk last week in Portugal from Dr. Keltner, who's a professor at Berkeley. And he says that he was actually a postdoc of Ekman's back in the day. And he says that there are not 6 facial expressions, there are actually 26. So he's identified many more using network analysis and machine learning and these new sophisticated tools that we have to say it's actually more than that. One of Ekman's other contributions was to say that people hide their facial expressions. They have what he called micro expressions, which means you basically briefly show something on your face. He said there were 15 milliseconds or less. And then that would show your true emotion, even though you were masking it like with a smile or something else. Other people have since debunked the idea of microexpressions. It's somewhat controversial. And most of us who study facial expressions and deception in general have sort of moved away from studying microexpressions because we've realized that the actual facial expressions that you show are probably more diagnostic than the actual microexpressions that you might be hiding. Zuckerman, DiPaolo, and Rosenthal offered the first theory of deceptive behavior in 1981. It's known very creatively as the four-factor theory, in which they identified 4 behavioral processes of deception. And their 4 factors were attempted control, which basically means a deceiver is trying to control everything. They don't want to show any signs of deception, and so they're very rigid and they don't give you any kind of clue. We're going to come back to that because it's actually very important in the research that I've done and other people have done. They also said arousal was something that would give the liar away. When you are lying, you're really kind of nervous and upset and excited, and so that arousal kind of is part of what leaks out. You might also have some negative emotion associated with lying, guilt and shame in particular. That might be something that you could pick on in leakage. And the last one, which is one that a lot of researchers are very interested in even today, is called cognitive load. In other words, it's more difficult cognitively to tell a lie than it is to tell the truth. And so you are going to have a more difficult time coming up with a plausible lie in the heat of the moment when you haven't planned anything out than if you were just telling the truth. Telling the truth means you have to use your memory, right? You have to tell somebody something that happened. But deceiving means you have to invent something. You have to say, oh, what do they already know? What can I do that doesn't contradict that? What have I already said? I don't want to contradict myself. So it's a lot more cognitively difficult, and that can really be a result of or imply a lot of leakage. In my field, in the field of communication, one of the most important theories, in my opinion, is called interpersonal deception theory. Dave Buller and Judy Burgoon, who's my former dissertation advisor, created this theory. And what they added that I think is important is the idea that up until then, the 4 factors, if you think of it, is all about the liar. What are they controlling? What are they feeling? How much cognitive load are they under? But what people in psychology who have studied deception often leave out is the fact that they're talking to someone. And the receiver also is trying to figure out if this is credible. They're trying to give appropriate feedback. They're also under cognitive load. And sometimes what the receiver does is just as important as what the deceiver does. So the receiver is the one who's listening to this story and maybe giving feedback, like maybe they look skeptical. And what we found is that the deceiver, when they see skepticism on the face of the receiver, they can change their story. They can look and say, oh, they're not buying it. I have to change this up. I have to say something different. And so they can adapt in real time to what the receiver is showing them and make themselves seem more credible. So in communication, we would argue that you can't just look at what is the deceiver doing. You have to look at both. It's a two-way street. Another very important breakthrough that came, there was this huge explosion of research in deception after Ekman's book that continued from the 80s into the 90s. And in 2006, Bond and DiPaolo did a meta-analysis of all of these, all of this research to try and figure out what do we know now. And what we can see, they did actually this meta-analysis in 2006 on accuracy of judges, like when you're trying to judge whether or not somebody is lying or telling the truth. And then they did another one that I'm going to talk about in 2003 on all the cues to deception that have been done, nonverbal cues. Both are very important meta-analyses. What they found in this meta-analysis in 2006 is that the average deception detection accuracy across all the studies was only 54%. And you can see this graph from their article that on the left side of the graph, you see this huge dispersion that some studies show as like 70% accuracy rate, and other studies might show 30 or 40%. But the larger the study, the more it converges toward this 54% accuracy. There's been other meta-analyses done in the field since then, and they also came up with 54% as the number. Tim Levine wrote an article not too long ago where he called this one of the most robust findings in all of social science, that you see again and again this 54% accuracy rate. Now we can improve that with some better questioning methods. What you see represented in the 54% is usually people coming to the lab, they see a video of somebody lying, a video of somebody telling the truth. They have to decide, is that a truth or a lie? And their accuracy will be about 54%. Now, if you think about it, that's only 4% bigger than flipping a coin. Just judging truth or lie is a coin toss. And so if you're actually interested in detecting deception, you want to do a lot better than 54%. That's pretty bad. And that basically tells me that deceivers or the actual human is not very good at detecting deception. It's basically chance. And we need to do better than that. There are other meta-analysis that they did in 2003, included 120 different samples from 116 different articles. And I argue that this is probably the most important study in the field of deception detection. If you're interested at all in deception, this is the article you really have to go read. It's been cited over 3,700 times, and it's been replicated several times as well since then in the 20 years since it was published. They found 158 behaviors, or cues that we call them, 75 of which are reported in fewer than 5 studies. So I tend to ignore those 75 cues because if it's come up in 1 study or 2 studies and wasn't replicated in any other studies, then that is probably an artifact. But if we look at the 158 cues, almost all of these are in experimental laboratory paradigms. So you come to the lab, you watch a video, and you have to judge whether that's lying or telling the truth. Only 14 of those cues, those 158 behaviors, are in more than 5 studies and achieve statistical significance, the p less than 0.05. And for those of you that study social science, you know that that's like our magic number. You have to have statistical significance in order to really even be discussed. Now, I know not all of you are social scientists. Not all of you are interested in the way that we look at mean differences between groups. So bear with me. I'm going to give you a very short explanation of what I mean by all that, because I'm going to throw a lot of numbers at you, and I want to make sure everybody's following me. So if you look at these 2 graphs, the red line represents liars, and the green line represents truth tellers. So this can be any variable. Say that this is fidgeting, right? And you can say, liars fidget less than people that are telling the truth, right? Because they're rigid, right? They're holding everything still. They don't move around very much. In graph A, you can see there's this mean difference that is statistically significant, right? 0.05. But you don't see a lot of dispersion around those differences. The means are actually pretty close to one another. In graph B, you can see the same thing. You see liars and truth tellers are the same mean difference apart. But here you see a lot of dispersion. So you might have people in the tails that are not very fidgety at all, and you have other people in the tails that are very fidgety. So we have to look at more than just a difference test between truth tellers and liars. You have to understand the magnitude of the differences between the groups, and this is what we call effect size. Again, forgive me for those of you that are statisticians for giving a simplistic example, but I want to make sure that everybody is on the same page when I give the numbers. So these 2 groups have the same mean difference, but the effect size will be much larger in figure A. That difference is much more meaningful than the one in figure B, where people are all over the map, and it's not really very meaningful to say that there's an average difference between truth tellers and liars. So in their 2003 meta-analysis, again, they had 158 cues. Only 14 of them achieved that p less than 0.05 and were in more than 5 of the studies. So what we see from liars is things like verbal and vocal immediacy. And these are, again, impressions that people get. They give more details. They use logical structure. They have more plausibility, more verbal and vocal involvement. They use more illustrator gestures. Again, those are the gestures that go along with speech. And they're more facially pleasant. They smile and show more pleasantness on their face. Now, one thing I would like you to notice is that when we're talking about effect size, usually we say a medium effect size is a 0.5, a large effect size is a 0.8, a small effect size will be 0.20 or smaller. The closer you get to 0, the less it even matters, right? If you have a 0 effect size, it means you don't have an effect. There's nothing going on there. So you'll notice that none of these are large effects. They're all pretty much small, maybe one that's medium, which is the voice, your immediacy in your voice. And so you can say that these are not hugely important variables for detecting deception. Even though they're technically diagnostic, I wouldn't call them big effects. Similarly, for liars, you see a list as well, that they give more discrepant and ambivalent statements, more verbal and vocal uncertainty. They're more nervous and tense. They give more vocal tension. They have higher vocal frequency and pitch. They give more negative statements and make more complaints, and they fidget a little bit more. They're moving around a little bit more. Very little, right? So these small effects are not really much to write home about. We can't really use them. So I look at this and I say, there is no Pinocchio's nose. None of these cues are going to tell us when someone is lying or telling the truth. Now, if I go back to the list and I say, well, here's my list, how many of them are nonverbal cues? Of the 158 cues, only 9 of them are. Vocal immediacy, vocal involvement, illustrator gestures, facial pleasantness, vocal uncertainty, nervousness or tension, vocal frequency or pitch, usually higher pitch, and more fidgeting. Again, not much to write home about, not really anything that you can say, aha, you're a liar because you had vocal tension. I wouldn't ever say that any of these cues are diagnostic to that extent. The other thing I want to show you out of this meta-analysis, and again, it's been replicated, but this is kind of the gold standard, so I'm still using this one, even though it's from 2003. I would like to show you some of the cues that were not diagnostic out of that meta-analysis. None of these achieved any statistical significance. And again, they're all in more than 5 studies, but none of these have very big effect sizes. Now, eye gaze and eye contact or gaze aversion is really one of the most common myths of deception detection. Everybody thinks liars won't look you in the eye. And there's been studies that show that's a global stereotype, not just something that we have in Western cultures, but every culture thinks that this is true. 80% of the cultures in one of Charlie Bond's cross-cultural analyses in over 100 countries found that this to be true. And they don't work. If you look at these effect sizes, 0.01, 0.03, it's infinitesimal. There is no effect. Shifty eyes, smiling, filled or unfilled pauses. So do liars say and more? No, they don't. Posture shifts, like moving around in your chair or moving around in your body, fidgeting with your own self, your own hands, for example, leg or foot movements, head nods, hand movements, facial action units. So this goes back to Ekman. Ekman identified those 6 facial expressions, and he also created a facial action coding scheme that people are still using today that basically identified these different landmarks on the face that would identify muscle movements. And none of them are very diagnostic by themselves either. And blinking, also not diagnostic. So if you look at this list, this is basically the liar stereotype. This is what people think liars do, and it turns out they don't. None of the studies found these, none of the meta-analyses have found these to be statistically significant. And you look at their effect sizes, they are definitely not even really worth talking about. So we learned all these things in 2003. You would think that people might have looked at that meta-analysis and said, oh, nonverbal cues, there's really not much going on there. Why would we continue studying nonverbal cues if really we're not finding any that are very diagnostic? In the 20 years prior to 2004, so you think, okay, the meta-analysis came out in 2003, give people a year to like read it and digest it and kind of change tracks. That I did my own Google Scholar search, and I found that articles on nonverbal or nonverbal with a hyphen deception detection, there were about 1,100 articles. And by the way, there's people, these 2 spellings are both common in the literature, which is why I search for both, but I tend to go with the non-hyphenated version. That's what we tend to use in the field of communication. And if you look at, for example, the Journal of Nonverbal Behavior, they don't have a hyphen. the nonverbal division of the National Communication Association, not hyphenated. So that's just, if you're looking for articles, though, you might have to use both because some people in other fields use the hyphenated. In the 20 years since 2004, I found 6,900 Google Scholar articles on nonverbal deception detection. So what happened? It's like people didn't, I mean, people obviously read that article because it's been cited 3,700 times, but people are still searching for Pinocchio's nose. I love this quote. I'm giving you the whole quote from Brennan and Magnuson in 2020. And they wrote, thus, any reliable nonverbal cues to lies and deceit ought to have been identified by now in 2020. Due to the clever experimental designs and creative use of real-life situations by highly competent researchers over the past few decades, we have got an answer to the critical question of whether or not we can detect deceit by looking at people's behavior. The answer is no. That's a definitive point of view. That is like, wow, okay. So you can see why Aldred Vrij has called for us to stop studying nonverbal cues to deception. We shouldn't be looking for them anymore. They just aren't there. So that's terrible news for me because I happen to be an expert in nonverbal cues to deception. What's someone like me or somebody interested in nonverbal behavior who also studies deception? What should we do? Should we just like retire and give up? I'm sorry, but I'm a little too young to retire. So I need to figure out what I'm going to do for the rest of my career. So I've come up with what I think is a reasonable research agenda for those of us in this area who might want to study deception detection and not necessarily abandon nonverbal cues entirely, but we can look at some other avenues of research that might be more fruitful. One is that we could shift our emphasis to verbal cues to deception. In the DiPaolo meta-analysis, they identified, 158 cues, and only about 20 of them were verbal. And that's because if you look at a lot of the studies that were done up until then, almost all of them were on nonverbal and very few on verbal. And so if we shift and we start talking more about linguistics and other verbal cues to deception, we might find something more diagnostic. I also want us to open our minds to the possibility that the absence of nonverbal cues may in and of itself be a diagnostic. For example, Judy Burgoon's research on the rigidity effect, that deceivers, because of that attempted behavioral control that we saw in the 4-factor theory, that they're so controlled that they don't give anything away, they don't move naturally and gesture and things like that. We also can move away from cues and examine patterns or clusters of behavior. So when I have to teach people about how to detect deception, like police officers sometimes ask me to come speak and things like that, I want us to move away from individual cues. There's no Pinocchio's nose. And so instead look for clusters or themes. And then finally, I'm going to talk about using modern tools like machine learning and AI to examine very subtle cues and patterns that perhaps are outside of human awareness and we can't really detect. So I'm going to talk about these 4 agendas very briefly and hopefully spur you to have some ideas of your own. The first one, if I can get my computer to switch screens, there we go, are verbal cues to deception. So what has been done? There's a really great article by Aldred Vrij, again, the Portsmouth researcher, in a journal called Brain Sciences, where he reviewed what verbal cues to deception entail. And they entail a few different things. One is something called the strategic use of evidence, or SUE, which is basically the idea that liars know something that people telling the truth don't know. Like in a criminal case, for example, the liar, the guilty person, will know what the murder weapon was, and a person telling the truth won't. And so if you can figure out what is the evidence that one person knows, it can exploit their avoidance and denial of liars. And this really only works in cases where you know what the missing piece of evidence is. It works well in criminal investigations, but might not work so well in like day-to-day kinds of things. Another thing that Aldred has been looking at is something called the verifiability approach, which I've done a study on this as well, and it seems very promising. The idea is that liars will provide details, right? So if you say, where were you? If a cheating husband gets asked by his wife, where were you last night? he will give details in order to look believable, right? He will say that, you know, he was at the pub, or he will say that he was somewhere, but he can't give what we call verifiable details. He can't say who he was there with because she might call them up and check his story, right? So he'll give a lot of detail, but not verifiable details. So that's an important difference between liars and truth tellers. Truth tellers will say, oh, I was at the pub with Simeon Yates and he can vouch for me, or I have a receipt that shows that I was there, or the pub has cameras on the wall outside. They have video evidence that I was there. You know, if I used the ATM as I walked up, and ATMs always have cameras. So all these kinds of verifiability details or verifiable details will be only present for truth tellers and not liars. There's also something called cognitive credibility assessment. And this is the idea that, going back to the 4-factor theory again, that liars are under greater cognitive load than people telling the truth because they're inventing, they're creating. And so when liars are trying to give a plausible story, they will have to pause longer and give shorter answers and these kinds of things that are embedded in their story. One thing that people like to do is impose even greater cognitive load. So if you say, where were you last night? People will tell a linear story. First I went here, then I went here, then I went here. If I say, tell me that in reverse order from the time you got home, going backwards, that's much more cognitively difficult. We don't do that very easily. And so a liar will have a harder time than that, and they'll give themselves away more than people telling the truth. There's also something called reality interviewing, which I don't have a lot of time to go through. It's a very complicated 5-phase interview protocol, but it extracts verbal cues that'll give a chance for us to detect deception. The idea, I think, in general, is you don't want to ask people questions that'll be yes or no. You don't want to ask people questions that'll really shut down their ability to elaborate. You want to get people talking. And the more that they're saying, the more kind of you have to go on. Next slide. There we go. There's a meta-analysis I'd like to share with you by Hausch et al. And they have cues to deception. They looked at 79 cues from 44 studied, extracted through a computer program called Luke. And I don't know if you're familiar with this. It was created by James Pennebaker at the University of Texas. And he and his team basically take transcripts of speech, and they can identify how many first-person pronouns, how many emotion words, how many connector words, how many conjunctions, all of these different kinds of things are in this sample of text. And a lot of people, since Luke came out, have been using it as a method of detecting deception. The way they organized their linguistic analysis was around sort of the common themes that have come up in deception research. So for example, do liars experience more cognitive load? They argue, yes, they can. Or yes, they do experience more. And that comes out in things like they use fewer words, but more sentences. So they're using shorter sentences. They're not elaborating as much. They're not as likely to have what we call linguistic diversity, which means they use the same words over and over again instead of being creative and coming up with different ways of saying something. They also use less complex sentences, so they have fewer exclusion words like but, except, or without. And they also, by the way, have like more simplistic sentence structure, so that might mean fewer clauses within the same sentence. They also asked, are liars less certain than truth tellers? And they said no, but they did find that there were a few markers of uncertainty. So, for example, they found fewer tentative words like may or seem or perhaps. And this might be because liars are trying to sound certain. They were more firm in their denial of guilt. And liars made fewer what we call spontaneous corrections. A spontaneous correction is when you're telling a story and you correct yourself. Like if you say, oh yeah, Simeon and I went to the pub on Tuesday. Oh wait, no, that wasn't Tuesday, that was Monday. That's a spontaneous correction. And you don't do it because someone's challenged you or pointed it out. You just do it because you're changing your story on the fly. And liars don't do that because they don't want to they don't want to look suspicious. I think that there are signs of uncertainty that have come up in other meta-analyses. We saw it in the DiPaolo meta-analysis, and we've seen it in nonverbal cues. So the fact that they didn't see any in linguistic cues might mean that uncertainty is more of a nonverbal than a verbal cue. They also asked, do liars use more negations and negative emotion words? And they found yes, they use more negative utterances, words like no and never and not. They used more negative emotion words, words like hate or worthless or enemy. And they used more anger terms, but they didn't use sadness or anxiety, so it was more restricted to anger. They also distanced themselves from their statements. In other words, they don't embrace the statement as much. They use fewer first-person pronouns and more third-person pronouns. In other words, you're less likely to say, I did this, I did that, because you're trying to distance yourself from what you're saying and not really make it about you. They used words that related to inner thoughts and cognitive processes less often than truth tellers. So they weren't really embracing that this was their experience. They were kind of giving subtle hints that and using we pronouns and kind of distancing themselves. In other words, they don't embrace the lie the way that other people do. Okay, so that's the verbal cues. The other thing I wanted to show you was a little bit about the absence of cues. And I do have a video from YouTube that won't allow me to play in the UK because it's apparently not available here. But this is an example from a poker game on an American television show where they basically show professional poker players. And this guy is bluffing. He's got a terrible hand. As you can see here, he's got a jack and a 9, and that's it. He's only 30% likely to win this hand. But he does win the hand because he bluffs. He is continuing to bet and trying to make his partner or his opponent feel like he has a strong hand when really he has a weak hand. But if you watch him throughout the game, that's basically his entire facial expression. He gives almost nothing away. He's wearing sunglasses to hide his eyes, for one thing, but he barely moves. I often have students that want to study poker players because they think that they can be rich and make money playing poker. And so they want to study poker players' facial expressions for their nonverbal communication class. And I tell them there's really nothing there. It's going to be the most boring paper you ever write because it's going to be a paper about nothing. There's nothing for you to see. This is what Judy Burgoon called the rigidity effect. She wrote an article in Frontiers and another article in JMIS with Nathan Twyman and others, where they basically argued that deceivers attempt to be so highly controlled so as not to give anything away. And the result is over control and really an unnatural lack of movement and gestures. And I've seen this in my own studies where I've seen people like sitting with their hands in their pockets, or they sit on their hands, like they put their hands underneath them. They put their hands in their lap. They give very few facial expressions, very few head nods and shakes. They basically sit there like statues because they're really trying hard not to give anything away. What I like to do, so often I get asked to give trainings. How do I detect deception? Police departments and other people that I've worked with have asked me to give trainings. And because I don't think that there's any Pinocchio's nose and there's no one cue, instead I tell them, forget about the cues, forget about the individual cues, and instead look for general patterns or clusters of behaviors. So for example, these are a couple of actors that I had come to my lab, and they showed a lot of tension. When liars are lying, you'll see this coming out in all those cues in the meta-analyses. They have higher vocal pitch, they have pupil dilation, they have vocal tension, they press their lips together, and they don't smile as much. They're basically tense and rigid, which is something that you see over and over again in the literature. They also tend to be more uncertain, they're more ambivalent, they tell less plausible stories, they're less involved and immediate, and they embrace their story less. They don't take ownership of it. That's what we saw in those first-person pronouns that they don't use. And they use more negative words. But overall, we'll see that they're not as certain. They don't embrace their lie as much as other people. And then the third cluster has to do with cognitive load. They pause longer because they have to think about their answers. So there's pauses within their speech. And they also wait longer to answer. There's something called response latency. They don't gesture as much, fewer illustrator, fewer hand-foot movements, more repetitions, and shorter answers. All of these are signs of cognitive load. So if you really want to detect deception, instead of looking at individual cues, you can't say, well, somebody, used a lot of repetition, therefore they're a liar. But if you see uncertainty, you see tension, you see cognitive load, that's not enough to call somebody a liar, but it's enough to probe more and to start asking more questions, especially when you compare this to their baseline. So sometimes people will ask me, well, don't some people just are more tense, like people are very introverted, or they might be neurodivergent or something like that. But these are always compared to their baseline of when they're truthful. So if somebody's naturally very gestural and happy and relaxed, and then suddenly they're tense, then that's a shift from their baseline, and that can be a cue that is an important one. The last thing I want to talk to you about is the tools that we now have available to us, things that Ekman didn't have in the 80s. I recently wrote a paper with Uj Delma and some other colleagues where we were looking at automatic lie detection from facial features. What we've seen is that the computer science community has started developing these tools that can read facial expressions. And some of them are commercially available, like Face Reader and Open Face, Open Pose. And they'll take these facial expression readers and try to use them to distinguish liars from truth tellers. And we wrote this paper looking at around 30 of these papers that have come out recently. One big problem that we saw in looking across this literature is that there are very few data sets, and the computer scientists who are doing this are doing their analyses on the same data sets over and over again. There's one data set in particular that's called the real life courtroom data set, which is really like court cases where they have people that they think are lying, perhaps because they got convicted, or people telling the truth, and they are establishing that they have different facial expressions than other people. Now, I think the courtroom data set is somewhat flawed because we don't have ground truth. We don't know for sure. Even if someone is guilty of a crime, that doesn't mean that they're lying every time they speak on the stand. They might only lie about some things and not other things. And so it's a flawed data set, but over half the literature is relying on that one data set. It's a real problem. The data sets are often very small, fewer than 50 people in them. And I struggle to see how we can make gross generalizations about people's facial expression off some very small samples. Most of them are in computer science proceedings and not journals, which means they're not easy to find and they're not very rigorously peer reviewed. They also are very heavily relying on the face. They're using facts and action units, and they're not really very often analyzing gestures or posture or all those other things that came out in the meta-analysis. And in fact, they often are looking for the things that were established 20 years ago as being not diagnostic. Eye gaze and eye blinks and eye behavior are already things that we should recognize from decades of research are not diagnostic. When you look at the algorithms that these articles have found, they found that the performance was not terrible. It's between 62 and 73% accuracy, depending on the classifier that was used, which you could argue, well, that's a lot better than the 54% that humans do without any kind of aid, which is true. It is true. It is better than 54%, which is basically just guessing. So we're doing a little bit better than guessing, but we're still a long way from 100%. We would not want to put someone in jail on the basis of a 73% accurate algorithm. We wouldn't even actually admit that in court. That's why polygraphs are not admissible in court in the US. I'm guessing they're not admissible here either. But it's because there's too much variation in the accuracy. So we still have a long way to go. One concern I have about using AI is that people want to apply it and then judge people as lying or telling the truth and leave the humans out of the loop. There's a few cautionary tales out there, like this is a story that was in the New York Times a couple of years ago about a father during the COVID pandemic. His son had an infection in his penis, his toddler. And he took a picture of it and sent it to the doctor. The doctor said, send me a picture. You can't come into the office because of the pandemic, but I can look at the pictures and then prescribe some antibiotics. He did. The kid was fine. everything worked out good. But what the father didn't realize is that his phone was automatically uploading all his photos to the cloud, and therefore they were in his Google Drive. Google filtered those photos and saw them as pictures of a child's penis and labeled him as a pedophile. And so he got banned from Google. This was a father, I believe he was a professional photographer, and all of his photos, all of his work product, all of his contacts, all of his emails, his invoices, everything was in his Google Drive, and he got locked out from all of it. And last I heard, he still has not gotten any of it back. So Google flagged him, and there's no human there to say, oh, clearly that's a mistake. Clearly that's not pedophilia. The emails, he got reported to the police, and the police looked at it and saw the doctor's email asking for the pictures and said, oh, okay, that's a reasonable medical thing. That's not pedophilia. And so the police were not concerned. The father was not charged with any crime, thank goodness. But Google doesn't have any humans behind it making these reasonable decisions. There's an article by Dave Markowitz and my friend Jeff Hancock, who's at Stanford University, who looked at AI decision making and deception, and they found that AI really has the same biases that humans have. One of the biases that we have is that when we are trying to decide, because we're at 54%, which is basically just guessing, if I watch somebody talking to me, I'm going to assume they're being truthful unless I have a reason otherwise. It's called the truth default, or some people call it the truth bias, and or some people call it the veracity effect. Whatever you call it, it's basically the idea that humans, when we are guessing, we err on the side of truth. And you know what? AI does too. So AI has the same biases as humans do. It's not like the AI is so much more objective than the humans. It's really not. But it lacks empathy or any kind of contextual understanding to say when we are making a mistake. So I have real concerns that some people would like to let AI make these decisions and flag people as lying or telling the truth. And we don't have humans in the decision making. That's a problem. This is a really good article I recommend to everyone to read. It's called Promises and Perils. It's about what we have to be careful of when we're trying to detect deception with artificial intelligence. And one of the things that they say, and also I said in my facial expression analysis paper that I just mentioned with Uj Delma, AI is a black box. We often don't know what's in the algorithm. We don't know what action units are they using. I don't know what facial expressions they're using. I don't know if they're things that already have been debunked as myths, or I don't know if they're actual diagnostic nonverbal cues. And most of the algorithms are proprietary, and we don't know what's in them. So that's a big problem. There's also, as I mentioned, the risk for bias. They mention this, so does Markowitz and Hancock. A lot of people are concerned about AI and biases. They also often use very small samples. As I mentioned, that was a problem in our study, and that's a problem in other people's studies as well. They often have no theoretical reason why they're putting some things in their algorithm and leaving other things out. They don't use the cognitive load theory or the verifiable theory or the leakage hypothesis. They just are basically scraping everything and putting it all in and hoping something comes out. One problem that we have with AI and using it for mass screenings is that we often will get false positives. So if you use it like in an airport, for example, you have people walk up to the kiosk, and the kiosk has you talk to an avatar. We're using it with thousands of people, and it can really flag a lot of people as lying. There was a case recently of a journalist who was using something called border control that they use at European border checkpoints. And he was a journalist for Le Monde magazine in France, and he got flagged as a criminal, saying he had something in his bag when he wasn't. He didn't have anything, and he was not a criminal. So he got flagged. There's a lot of false positives that scare people. I've seen it done successfully. If you try and think about AI as collaborative with humans and whether or not we can actually work together to try and solve this. This is from a company called Discern Science. And full disclosure, this is the company that was founded by my old dissertation advisor, Judy Burgoon, And so I sometimes am a consultant for Discern. It's the only company I consult for, because I've been working with Judy for so many years. An avatar, they say right on their website, an avatar can effectively partner with existing security teams. So they're not trying to replace humans. They have these kiosks, like you might see at an airport. You put your passport in and it asks you questions about what you have in your bag and what countries you've been to and what your destination is. And they have a desktop version as well that they're using with companies to try and screen employees. They have a lot of high-tech companies that are worried about industrial espionage, or you have there's a company that they work with in the Caribbean and Latin America that is using it for employees that work at airports to make sure that they don't have family members that are smuggling things and things like that. So they're using it in real world context now, and it basically has all the sensors on it, and it's getting your facial expressions and your gestures and your voice and your posture and all these different cues at once. And then, but it's collaborating with humans. It's not making the decision by itself. I think that is something that is really important part of what Discern is doing that other companies I don't think are necessarily doing. So I'm almost at my hour. I will end with some concluding thoughts. I don't think we should be relying solely on nonverbal cues to detect deception. Despite the title of my talk, which was Nonverbal Cues to Deception, I think it's really not there. I think you have to use nonverbal cues, if you use them at all, that you use them in conjunction with verbal cues and only as part of like clusters or patterns that bring everything together. We have to have a mix of verbal and nonverbal, and even consider that perhaps the absence of cues, like in the rigidity effect, are perhaps diagnostic. I also think we need to make sure that we avoid the stereotypical cues like eye blinks and eye gaze that are not diagnostic. And we can get help from machine learning or AI that can detect cues that humans miss, but we have to do it in collaboration with AI and not let AIs replace human judgments. I thank you for your time, and I will stop sharing my screen now so that I can open it up to any questions that you might all have. Thank you.
So, Norah, huge thanks for that. I'm still fascinated. I've still got loads of questions myself. I think we've got a Q&A function on this call where people can put some questions in if there are any, but I am also conscious that we're pretty much only got a minute or two left of our hour for this. So if anyone's got any questions, either put them in the chat or the Q&A. That's the point at which everybody doesn't want to put themselves. If nobody's feeling up to asking a question,
you can also email me. My email address is ndunbar@ucsb.edu, and I'd be happy to answer any email questions that people might have.
Can I ask one question then?
Yes.
Right, because I didn't ask this yesterday. So when I studied conversation analysis and ethnomethodology, there is a famous paper in all of that that's about everyone's a liar, that we all tell little white lies just to make conversations work. Like, you know, whatever it is, you know, have you had a good day today? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So where does that fit in all of this?
Yeah, I think there's obviously politeness norms. You know, you see somebody in the elevator and they say, "Oh, how are you?" And you say, "Oh, I'm having the worst day of my life. Let me tell you all about it." Right? That's not really the way that people expect those conversations to go. Pardon me. And I think that you have to really, when you're trying to discern whether or not something's deception, you have to look at the intent. So what we say is deception is intentionally giving somebody information that you know to be false. There's usually sort of a malicious reason for it. But sometimes we tell what we call altruistic lies, right? If you're at a friend's house and they've made you dinner and you think it's disgusting, you might say, "Oh, it's, you know, a really interesting flavor." You know, you're not going to say, "Oh, this is unedible," right? So we might change the way that we say things in order to be polite. And I don't know that most people would have too many concerns about that and call that, you know, any kind of malicious deception.
Okay. We haven't got any questions in the Q&A. We've got some thank yous for a fantastic presentation, but we haven't got any questions at the moment. I'm conscious we're close to the hour, and I also know that Norah's got to travel on today, tomorrow. So if anyone does have any further questions, please email Norah. And if for any reason you can't find Norah's email address, you can always email the DDRC team and we can pass any questions on. Okay, I'm going to let everybody go and get coffee. Norah, can I thank you once again for the presentation? Fascinating stuff. Look forward to talking to you more about the work we're doing, and safe travels back to the USA.
Thank you.
Oh, there's a question now. There's a question. It says, does the 54% accuracy change in studies if the untrained person is able to question a person rather than simply deciding from a video?
Yes, it does. So if and there are some questions that elicit more diagnostic behavior than others. So with some proper training on questioning techniques and some more effective questioning, then we do get higher accuracy, but it's still not great. It's still like in the 70s. The percentages of accuracy is still not anything that is like amazing. But yes, it does get better if you get to ask questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Oh, one more. Have we got one? I've got a question, but I can't formulate it. Great, Wednesday. Thank you. So Elizabeth, when you've formulated that question, if you email it to Norah, I'm sure she'll get you an answer.
Yeah.
Okay, conscious of time, we've hit the hour, and unfortunately we've got another meeting starting here at this end. Again, huge thanks, Norah. Be in touch. Safe travels home, and thank you very much again for doing this for the team here.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.